Okay, so let's talk about the Battle of Tours. You've probably heard of it, right? Way back in the year 732, near a city in what we now call France, two massive forces collided. And for centuries, this battle has been painted as the moment, the one that saved all of Europe from Islamic conquest. But, was it really that simple? Let's dig in and try to separate the legend from what actually went down.
Yeah. This is pretty much the image that pops into your head, isn't it? You've got Charles Martel, they called him the Hammer, leading his Christian warriors against this massive invading army. It's got everything. It's epic, it's romantic, a single battle that supposedly defined an entire continent. But, as we're about to see, history is almost never that black and white.
And look, this idea isn't new. This quote from the historian Henry Hallam really sums up that traditional viewpoint perfectly. For a long time, big-name historians like Edward Gibbon were basically saying, hey, if the Franks had lost this one, the entire course of Western civilization would have been completely different. It was seen as one of the definitive turning points in world history. No small claim, right?
Okay, so to really get what's happening at Tours, we need to rewind a bit. We've got to understand the major players here. Because this wasn't some random skirmish in a field. No way. This was the boiling point after decades of expansion and conflict.
I mean, just look at the sheer scale of the Umayyad Caliphate. We're talking about what was arguably the world's #1 military superpower at the time. After conquering all of North Africa, they swept right across the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, and they weren't stopping. They were now pushing north, over the Pyrenees Mountains.
So let's break it down. On one side, you've got this massive, sprawling, battle-hardened empire. And on the other side, you've got the Frankish kingdom. Now, they were a serious power, for sure, but much more of a regional one in Western Europe. And they were led by this incredibly shrewd and ambitious guy, a mayor of the palace named Charles Martel.
And their advance into Gaul, what we now call France, was fast. After setting up a base in a city called Narbonne, Umayyad forces just kept pushing north. A local ruler, Duke Odo of Aquitaine, actually managed to stop them for a bit, winning a battle in 721. But fast forward about a decade, and he was completely crushed. His army was shattered, and he had literally nowhere else to turn. So he does the one thing he probably didn't want to do. He appeals for help from his big rival, Charles Martel.
And that brings us to the battle itself. Okay, so here's where things start to get a little, murky. The sources we have from that time, they leave a ton of questions unanswered. And we can start with the most basic one of all. How many soldiers were actually on that field? Just take a look at these estimates. They're all over the map. You've got these older accounts claiming the Umayyad army was this massive horde of 80,000 or even more. But then modern historians come along and say, hang on a second. When you think about the logistics, feeding an army that big, the numbers were probably way smaller and maybe even pretty evenly matched. And get this, one source from the time actually suggests the Franks were the ones with more soldiers. The bottom line, we just don't know for sure. So, if the numbers are a big question mark, what can we actually piece together about the fight itself? Well, it turns out we actually know quite a bit. And what it boils down to is a classic showdown between two totally different ways of fighting. Okay, so the Umayyad army's biggest advantage was its cavalry. Fast-moving, heavy cavalry charges. The Franks, on the other hand, under Charles Martel, they fought on foot as this super disciplined, heavily armed infantry. It really is like that classic hammer versus an anvil situation. Oh, and even the weather was a factor. The Franks were bundled up for a cold European autumn, but their opponents, not so much.
And this is where Charles Martel's strategy was just brilliant. First, he managed to show up completely by surprise. Then, he chose the battlefield, picking a wooded, high-ground spot that would totally mess with a cavalry charge. By setting up his men on that hill, he basically forced the Umayyad cavalry to charge uphill right into them. He completely neutralized their #1 weapon.
And listen to this quote from a chronicle written not long after the battle. It just captures the scene so perfectly. It says, "The northern peoples, the Franks, remained as immobile as a wall, holding together like a glacier. For about a week, the two armies just sort of sized each other up with little skirmishes. But when the main fight finally kicked off, the Umayyad cavalry charged again and again and again. And that Frankish square, it just held. It was a wall of shields and spears that absolutely would not break."
And then came the turning point. In the middle of all this fighting, the Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was killed. And just like that, with their leader gone, the morale of the invading army completely collapsed. That very night, they just abandoned their camp and started a full-on retreat back south toward the mountains.
So, There you have it. A huge victory for the Franks. The invaders are retreating. Europe is saved. End of story. Right? Well, not so fast. When you look at what happened after the battle, the picture gets a whole lot more complicated.
I mean, check out this timeline. The Battle of Tours was in 732, but the conflict was nowhere near over. Just 3 years later, another big Umayyad force comes back, capturing major cities. Charles Martel himself spent years fighting them back, and he never even managed to retake the key city of Narbonne. That job ended up falling to his son, Pepin, many years down the road.
27. Let that sink in. For 27 more years after the supposedly world-saving battle, the Umayyads still held territory in what is now France. So, yeah, this clearly wasn't the clean final knockout blow that the legend makes it out to be.
So if it didn't actually end the war, what was the most important, the most undeniable result of the Battle of Tours? Well, it all comes down to politics. The victory became this legendary achievement that absolutely cemented Charles Martel's power. It was the political juice his family, the Carolingians, needed to eventually push aside the old kings and take the throne for themselves. This win wasn't just about a battle, it was the founding story for a whole new dynasty, one that would hit its peak with his famous grandson, Charlemagne.
Which, brings us right back to our big question at the start. How should we think about this battle today? And honestly, modern historians are pretty much split into two main camps on this.
Okay, so on one side you have the traditional view. Tours was a world-changing battle that stopped the tide of Islamic expansion and saved Christianity in Europe. But then you have the other side, a more modern take. This view says, hold on, the Umayyad force was probably more of a big raid, not a full-on invasion. Plus, the Caliphate was already stretched thin and dealing with its own internal problems. And according to this argument, the battle's importance got massively exaggerated later on by historians working for Charles Martel's family. And why would they do that? Simple. To create a heroic origin story for their new empire. By painting Charles as the savior of Christendom, they made their family's rule look legitimate and helped create this whole idea of a single unified Christian Europe.
So what's the verdict? The Battle of Tours was, without a doubt, a major victory for the Franks, and it had huge political consequences. But its reputation as the battle that saved Europe, well, that's a powerful story, isn't it? And it's a story that was carefully built and polished long after the actual fighting stopped. And that really leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on. How much of history is about what actually happened, and how much of it is about the story we decide to tell about it later?